Urban Inferno, Reacher's mission. Chapter 1. The First Shot. Jack Reacher hadn't planned to stop in Granton. He'd caught the last bus out of a dreary town across the state line, eyes set on the next destination, nowhere in particular. But, as always, he followed his instincts more than any set path. So when the bus rolled into Granton, he stepped off without a second thought. By dusk, he was in a dimly lit bar, hoping for a quick meal and maybe some quiet. But Reacher noticed the small things other people missed. A group of young men, their shirts stretched awkwardly over the shapes of concealed weapons, slipped in and out of the bar, muttering to each other in low, hurried tones. Reacher watched their darting eyes, the way they checked the door constantly, and he could feel it, the charge in the air. Granton was a powder keg. Someone just had to light the match. Reacher hadn't been in town more than an hour, yet he already knew trouble when he saw it. As he settled at a corner table, the bartender eyed him warily, a quick flick of his gaze suggesting Reacher didn't exactly blend in with the regulars. The place was rough, packed with men who carried the grit and tension of people surviving a hard life. But it was clear that someone new in town, especially someone like Reacher, stood out. Just as he was about to order, a commotion broke out near the door. One of the young men he'd noticed earlier burst in, shouting into his phone, "Tell him it's all set. The shipment is tonight." He didn't realize his voice had carried. Or maybe he didn't care. Reacher's eyes narrowed. He wasn't a cop, didn't work for any agency. But a shipment of what? And for who? The pieces started lining up in his mind. Guns, tension in the air, gangs circling the streets like wolves on the prowl. Reacher didn't wait. He stood up, left his seat and casually followed the man outside. The bar's narrow alley smelled of oil and trash, and the young man had his back turned, still talking into his phone. Reacher was on him in 2 strides, his hand firm on the guy's shoulder, cutting the call short. The young man tensed up, and Reacher saw a flash of panic in his eyes before he tried to regain control. "What's your deal, man? You got a death wish?" "Depends," Reacher replied coolly. "Who's the shipment for, and why tonight?" "None of your business," the guy spat, shoving Reacher's hand off. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Reacher held his ground, his gaze steady. "Try me, because I think you're about to give me some answers." Before the young man could respond, headlights washed over them, and a dark SUV rolled slowly to a stop at the edge of the alley. Its tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside, but Reacher sensed the sudden, dangerous shift in the air. The man he'd been questioning paled, glancing nervously at the SUV before he turned and bolted down the alley, leaving Reacher alone. The SUV's door cracked open, and a tall, burly figure stepped out, eyes locking onto Reacher. His expression was cold, calculating, a man who didn't play games. "You're new in town," he called out, his voice steady and unfazed. "And you're asking the wrong questions. People who do that, they don't last long around here." Reacher took a step forward, unflinching. "You planning to find out just how long?" The man smirked, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Don't bother. Just stay out of our way, and we won't have a problem." "Your way," Reacher repeated, voice laced with iron. "What's your way? Trafficking guns to kids barely old enough to drive, stirring up a war in a city that's barely holding together." "Do yourself a favor," the man replied, his gaze like steel. "Forget what you heard. Forget you ever saw me. Just turn around and leave." Reacher's face was unreadable, his stance calm. "I don't think so." The man's smirk disappeared, replaced by a glare. Without another word, he got back into the SUV and drove off, leaving Reacher alone in the dark alley, a single thread of tension stretched taut across the night. Whatever was coming, it wouldn't end well. For any of them. Chapter 2. The Trail of Fire. Reacher didn't hesitate. He had 2 choices: turn his back and let the city tear itself apart, or dive in head first and get answers the hard way. He chose the latter. Royce spotted Reacher first, his face contorting with anger and fear. "You again?" he yelled, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Reacher didn't respond. He advanced through the smoke, zeroing in on Royce. The gang members fanned out, but in the confusion, they were as likely to hit each other as they were him. Reacher seized the moment, charging forward and knocking the first man to the ground with a brutal punch. Another came at him, but Reacher sidestepped, sending him crashing into a pile of crates. The burners and riptides opened fire, but the thick smoke clouded their vision, and panic started to spread. Reacher moved through them with precision, taking down one man after another, each strike calculated and merciless. Royce shouted orders, trying to regain control, but his men were already faltering, lost in the haze of smoke and flame. Finally, Reacher cornered Royce, who had backed up against a shipping container, a look of terror on his face. "Listen, we can work something out," Royce stammered, his voice trembling. "I can pay you. Whatever you want, just name your price." "You're out of options," Reacher replied coldly. "You tried to turn this city into a battlefield, and I don't think it's in your budget to buy your way out of this." Royce's eyes darted around, desperate for an escape, but there was none. Reacher's gaze was as unyielding as steel. Royce's fear turned to anger, and he lunged, hoping to catch Reacher off guard. But Reacher was ready. He sidestepped the attack, grabbed Royce by the collar, and drove him into the container wall, the impact knocking the fight out of him. With Royce subdued, Reacher turned back to the remaining gang members who had finally realized they were outmatched. The riptides and burners scattered, abandoning their weapons and fleeing into the night. The once bustling rail yard was now empty, littered with fallen weapons and the crackling remains of burning crates. Reacher hauled Royce to his feet, keeping a firm grip on his collar. "You're going to walk out of here and turn yourself in," he said, his voice low and deadly. "And if you ever set foot in Granton again, you won't get a second warning." Royce nodded frantically, too shaken to argue. Reacher released him, watching as the arms dealer stumbled away, limping toward the distant glow of police lights arriving at the scene. Barnes had likely received Reacher's message and sent backup. They'd find Royce waiting, and with any luck, it would be the last time the arms dealer caused trouble in this city. As the first streaks of dawn broke over the horizon, Reacher stood alone in the rail yard, surveying the aftermath. The guns had been destroyed or confiscated, and the burners' plans lay in ruins. Granton would see another day, free from the bloodbath the gangs had planned. He walked away as the police swarmed the scene, heading back into the city with nothing but his coat and the satisfaction of a job done. He'd be gone by the time anyone could ask questions, back on the road, moving on to the next town. Because that's what he did. He never stayed long, and he didn't leave a trace. But wherever he went, one thing was certain. Jack Reacher left cities safer than he found them. The end. After the SUV disappeared into the night, Reacher followed the young man's trail. It was risky, but he'd learned that criminals and fools shared one trait. They rarely looked over their shoulders. The young man moved with nervous energy, glancing back now and then, but never noticing the quiet figure a few steps behind him. As they wound through a maze of streets, the neighborhoods grew darker, marked by gang graffiti and broken windows. The pulse of Granton's underground crime world was everywhere. The young man finally slipped into a narrow brick building tucked between two warehouses. Reacher watched from the shadows, waiting a few moments before approaching the entrance. Voices echoed from inside, young men laughing, their tones edged with something darker. From what he overheard, the building served as a headquarters for the group. They called themselves the Burners, and according to their leader, tonight was a big night. Reacher crept closer to the doorway, catching snippets of conversation. The Burners were restless, pacing the room as they loaded guns, stacking boxes of ammunition. The leader, a wiry guy with tattoos creeping up his neck, spoke with a twisted smile. By tomorrow morning, this city won't know what hit it. Our rivals think they can muscle in on us. Tonight, we show them what real firepower looks like. It wasn't just bravado. Reacher knew the look in those men's eyes, violent, focused, and itching for a fight. The leader pointed to a crate in the corner, filled to the brim with military-grade weapons, assault rifles, grenades, tactical vests. It was enough firepower to hold off an army. Reacher's mind worked quickly. If he could dismantle their supply chain, maybe he could stop whatever massacre they had planned. He didn't waste time. Reacher backed out, blending into the darkness as he made his way toward the center of town. He'd seen enough to know Granton was on the edge of a full-scale gang war, and these burners were about to be the spark. His first stop would be a police contact in a nearby precinct, a guy named Barnes, who might not be squeaky clean, but wasn't afraid to talk. Granton's police precinct was a tired, crumbling building with peeling paint and flickering lights. Inside, the mood was grim. Officers muttered over cases piling up faster than they could solve them. Reacher asked for Barnes, who appeared moments later with a look of mild surprise. "Jack Reacher," Barnes said, sizing him up. "Not exactly a name you expect to see in a place like Granton. What brings you here?" Reacher got straight to the point. "There's a shipment of military-grade weapons moving through town tonight. The burners are arming up for something big. Thought you'd want to know." Barnes ran a hand over his face, sighing. "Damn it! We've heard rumors, but nothing concrete. You're saying they're about to hit the streets?" "Unless someone stops them," Reacher replied, his tone steady. "And if you're outmatched, I'll handle it myself." Barnes studied him, clearly weighing his options. After a moment, he leaned in. "If the burners are stockpiling weapons, they're getting them from someone local. A supplier who's either stupid, greedy, or both. There's a guy named Royce, arms dealer who's been around for years. He's got ties to half the gangs in town. Could be he's the one fueling this mess." Reacher nodded. "Where do I find him?" "Warehouse District, edge of town. Royce operates out of a place called the Steel Mill. It's an old factory, abandoned and reeking of trouble." Barnes paused. "But watch yourself. Royce is slippery, and he won't hesitate to put you down if he thinks you're a threat." Reacher's gaze was unwavering. "Thanks for the tip." As Reacher turned to leave, Barnes called out, "One more thing. This gang, the Burners, they're not just in it for the turf. Rumor has it they're planning to expand, bring other gangs under their rule. If they succeed, this town will be a war zone." Reacher didn't respond, but his expression was grim. He knew exactly what that meant. A single gang, ruling through force and fear, would bleed this city dry. He had one chance to cut the head off the operation before it spiraled out of control. Outside, Reacher slipped through the dark streets toward the steel mill. The air grew colder, and the city seemed to close in, its shadows lengthening as night set in. He approached the mill, its massive structure looming in the darkness, rusted walls and shattered windows a testament to years of abandonment. Inside, he could see faint lights. Royce's operation was running full throttle tonight, and Reacher wasn't about to let them get away with it. He crouched by a side door, the faint sound of voices coming through the thin metal. A few men stood guard, their conversation barely masking the clinking of crates and the hum of machinery inside. Reacher's mind calculated his next move. He didn't need a team, just precision and timing. He waited until one of the guards moved to light a cigarette, the orange glow casting brief shadows. Reacher struck fast and silent, his hands a blur as he disarmed the guard, rendering him unconscious with a quick, brutal strike. With the door clear, Reacher slipped inside, his steps soundless as he approached the heart of the operation. He spotted Royce at a desk, barking orders and overseeing crates being loaded with guns, each marked with the names of Burners' rival territories. Tonight was indeed going to be a bloodbath, unless Reacher stopped it right here, right now. Chapter 3. The steel mill ambush. Reacher moved through the shadows of the steel mill, careful and calculated. Royce was in the center of the room, surrounded by crates of weapons and his guards, each armed to the teeth. The air was thick with the metallic scent of oil and the weight of impending violence. Reacher had disrupted operations like this before, but Royce's setup was bigger than most. This wasn't just a street gang playing with stolen weapons. This was an organized pipeline designed to supply an entire underground network. He stayed close to the walls, inching forward, assessing the angles and counting heads. 5 guards around Royce, 2 close by and 3 pacing the edges, keeping watch on the loading operation. Reacher's mind worked quickly. He had to take them out one by one, keeping it quiet until he could get his hands on Royce. Timing was everything. As one of the pacing guards turned his back, Reacher struck fast, pulling the man into the shadows, knocking him out cold with a swift blow. The guard slumped to the ground, and Reacher dragged him behind a stack of crates before moving on. One down, he moved to the next, waiting until the guard's gaze drifted. Reacher lunged, locking his arm around the man's neck, silencing him instantly. 2 down. His movements were precise, his strikes quick. Years of training and countless encounters had taught him the art of stealth. By the time Royce's men noticed something was wrong, it was too late. "Where's Mason?" one of the remaining guards asked, peering around nervously. Reacher took advantage of their confusion, sweeping in to disarm the 3rd guard and knocking him to the ground with a powerful strike. Only 2 remained now, and the tension was rising. Royce noticed the disruption, his gaze narrowing as he scanned the shadows. "Who's out there?" Royce barked, his voice echoing in the vast mill. He was more cautious now, ordering his remaining guards to fan out. "Find him now!" But Royce's command came too late. Reacher struck again, taking down the 4th guard with a silent efficiency that left Royce isolated. Reacher stepped out from the shadows, his expression cold as he fixed his eyes on the man responsible for arming the burners. "Looking for me?" Reacher's voice cut through the air, calm but laced with an unmistakable threat. Royce's eyes widened, but he quickly masked his surprise. "You're making a big mistake, whoever you are. You know who you're dealing with?" "Enough to know you're not walking out of here with those guns," Reacher replied, taking a measured step closer. "Unless you want this place to go up in flames." Royce forced a smirk, but Reacher could see the fear behind it. "You think you can just walk in here and shut us down? The burners own this city. By tomorrow, every rival gang is going to fall in line or they'll be wiped out." "Not if they don't have any guns," Reacher countered. "And from where I'm standing, you're about to lose every single one." Royce's face twisted with anger, and he reached for a pistol tucked in his waistband. But Reacher was faster. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance, knocking Royce's hand away and sending the gun skittering across the floor. Royce staggered back, barely keeping his balance. Reacher advanced, his voice low and deadly. "You have 2 choices. Either you walk out of here in handcuffs, or this gets messy. Your call." Royce laughed, a desperate, hollow sound. "You really think you scare me? I've got an army of men out there waiting for my word. One call, and you're dead." Reacher shrugged. "Go ahead. Call them, but I'm guessing they won't get here fast enough to save you." Royce hesitated, the cockiness draining from his face as he took in the unflinching look in Reacher's eyes. What do you want?" he stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper now. "Simple. You're going to give me the names of every person you've sold to in this city," Reacher said, his tone ice cold. "You're going to shut this operation down, or I'll tear it down myself piece by piece." For a moment, Royce looked like he might fight back. His jaw clenched, and his gaze flicked toward the crates of guns and the scattered remains of his guards. But Reacher didn't give him time to second guess. "Start talking," Reacher ordered, his stance solid, daring Royce to make a wrong move. Royce looked around, desperation etched into every line of his face. He finally sighed, his shoulders slumping as the weight of defeat sank in. All right, fine. I'll tell you what you want. But you don't know who you're messing with. You shut this down and they'll come after you. Let them try, Reacher replied. Now start talking. Reluctantly, Royce began listing the gang territories he'd supplied, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the factory. The burners, the riptides, a handful of other smaller crews, all heavily armed, all waiting for the right moment to ignite a citywide turf war. When Royce finished, Reacher stepped back, watching him with an expression as cold as steel. Good. Now here's what you're going to do next. But before he could finish, a noise from outside stopped him. The sound of footsteps, multiple pairs, closing in fast. Reacher's instincts kicked in immediately. Reinforcements. He had to move, and fast. Looks like your friends finally showed up, Reacher said, his eyes locked on Royce. Guess we'll finish this another time. Without another word, Reacher moved, slipping back into the shadows as the doors burst open, a group of heavily armed men storming in, calling out for Royce. Reacher navigated the dark maze of crates, moving silently through the mill as he headed for an exit. Royce's panicked shouts echoed behind him, lost in the chaos of his operation, crumbling from within. Reacher slipped out a side door and into the night, his mind racing. He had the information he needed to dismantle Royce's supply chain and disrupt the burners' plans. But it was only the beginning. The battle for Granton had just started, and Reacher knew he was right in the middle of it. How will Reacher strike next in this battle against the burners? Stay tuned for the next chapter. Things are only getting more dangerous. Chapter 4. The Final Strike. Reacher didn't slow down once he left the steel mill. Royce's information had given him a blueprint of Granton's criminal network, one that pointed straight to a midnight arms deal at an abandoned rail yard on the city's outskirts. This deal was the burners' final step in their plan, and if he stopped it, he'd leave the gang's ambitions in shambles. The rail yard was quiet when Reacher arrived, the only sounds coming from a distant highway and the rustling of weeds that had taken over the tracks. He found an elevated position in a rotting, rusted-out rail car. From there, he had a full view of the central area where the deal would go down. Soon enough, headlights cut through the darkness as a convoy of SUVs pulled up to the meeting point. Reacher watched as burners stepped out armed and alert, their eyes scanning the perimeter. They weren't alone. A second group arrived, looking equally prepared. Both sides were cautious, and the tension was as thick as the fog rolling in from the river. If you enjoyed our story, Reacher could see why the burners were meeting with another gang, the Riptides, to split territories and divide control of the gun supply. If this alliance solidified, Granton would belong to them by morning. Reacher shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of Royce. The arms dealer was supervising the exchange, overseeing crates of rifles and ammo as they were unloaded from the SUVs. Everything was moving like clockwork, and Reacher knew he had to strike before the two gangs completed their deal. Once the shipment was fully handed over, Granton's fate would be sealed. He reached into his pocket, retrieving a small flare. Reacher didn't carry weapons often, but he'd found the flare in a supply closet back at the steel mill. It was enough. He lit it and tossed it into a stack of nearby crates. Flames shot up instantly, illuminating the rail yard and casting long shadows across the men below. Shouts erupted as they scrambled, trying to contain the sudden blaze. Using the distraction, Reacher moved swiftly down from the rail car and closed in on the group. The burners and Riptides were already on edge, and his unexpected arrival pushed them into chaos. They turned, weapons drawn, searching for the intruder as smoke billowed into the sky.